Okay, yeah, so what I was going to talk about today, when I was talking to Dennis during the week, he was interested in thinking about the blockchain or open data in relation to not just open data, but maybe governance. So I thought I could talk a little bit about new forms of governance that are emerging around the intersection of data and algorithms. The blockchain maybe as some kind of a counter governance then, and also some of the problems with that. I think the blockchain is really interesting, but I also think that there's a lot of hype around it at the moment. So I think I was counting out, I think I'm giving 8 different talks on the blockchain in the next 2 months. So I think maybe it's also important that we sort of critically reflect a little bit on that as well. So yeah, I want to begin by saying that governance is changing quite a lot. So a lot of people are arguing that we're seeing maybe a third mode of governance beyond the state and the market, as information and communication technologies partner with, or some cases replace or displace, functions that were previously being performed by the state. So, yeah, so saying we're seeing a third mode of governance that's maybe different from the state or the market, as information and communication technologies are sort of partnering with states, or in some cases replacing or displacing things that states previously did. And along with that then, we're also seeing new kinds of rules. So what we might call algorithmic rules as opposed to legal or normative or market forms of regulation. So yeah, I want to talk about maybe what are some of the features then of this kind of governance? How does it transform maybe questions of security or citizenship or publics? And I just wanted to go through maybe a few different ways that this governance is different from other kinds of governance. So one is that we can maybe say that algorithmic governance is calculated. So what I meant by that was that it's using maybe mathematical formulas instead of using reason or other kinds of maybe human rationality to determine, you know, what constitutes a public, what constitutes a citizen, what constitutes a foreigner inside and outside, and all these questions to do with governance or whether you're a threat. And so instead of reason, that maybe we have things like patterns and anomalies. So an example of this is something like the kinds of calculated publics that you even see with something like Amazon. So this is from my Amazon account, and it's kind of, I suppose, showing me what customers who are interested in questions of algorithmic governance have also bought. So I bought The Black Box Society by Frank Pascal. These are some other books. So this is sort of a collective or a calculated public that's being produced by Amazon. But we don't really understand who's inside or outside of that public or how that public actually functions. This, obviously, the Amazon is kind of one small example, but we could arguably say that questions of citizenship are increasingly algorithmic in nature, as opposed to being questions of where you are born or who your parents are, that citizenship is being determined algorithmically. So in NSA, for example, we're running specific analyses on emails which determined whether somebody was a foreigner or not a foreigner. So you were a foreigner, you know, if kind of the results produce more than 50% probability that you're a foreigner, your citizenship was in question. So this is a kind of a different model of citizenship then that we might be used to. I don't know if anyone's come across ADAMS, which is Anomaly Detection at Multiple Scales, which is a new DARPA program, which is sort of designed to detect the next whistleblowers. So people who are within a public who are perceived as a threat. And again, this is based, it's kind of a calculation of publics, a calculation of foreigners or the other, which is produced through this idea of anomalies or patterns. So it's establishing a pattern and then looking for kind of strange anomalies in that might predict that you're going to leak data, for example, or be the next Edward Snowden. So as well as being calculative, we could say that algorithmic governance is generative. So it not only shapes conditions in the present, but it also shapes conditions going forward in the future. A good example that people are probably familiar with is something like predictive policing, which is that real Minority Report example where in LA, for example, they're experimenting with using algorithms to predict basically where crimes are going to occur next, so that you can actually deploy law enforcement before something actually happens. Now, the argument that's often made about algorithmic governance is that it's more neutral because it doesn't have any human bias. So it's just a machine making some kind of a decision. So there's no bias, there's no prejudice within these kinds of algorithms. But, you know, as we've come to see, that really isn't the case. It's actually that these biases and prejudices get hard-coded into the system and reproduced in ways that are difficult to account for. So these are a couple of famous examples. I don't know if you've come across this one. It was a Google autocorrect a couple of years ago. So didn't you mean he invented? If somebody put in she invented in Google. There was a recent article I came across about relationships between racial profiling and Google searches as well, where they noticed that people with African American names, a Google search would actually also bring up ads about criminal records and legal aid and all of these kinds of things. This is Amazon Fail, which I think was a case where books with any kind of homosexual content on Amazon were automatically classed as adults. So Heather Has Two Mommies, which is a book for children, was X-rated according to this algorithm. So we can see that they're not actually biased at all. But then the problem is that these biases and these decisions are outside of human accountability often. So they're not transparent either. We don't often understand exactly how these decisions are being made. They're not legible or transparent to us. So we're looking at maybe knowledge infrastructures that are in some ways beyond some kind of human accountability. Matteo Pasquinelli calls this an algorithmic eye. There's somebody trying to do it again. So yeah, it's kind of a knowledge or knowledge infrastructure that in some ways is non-human, because we can't really understand the decisions that are being made because they're quite complex. And finally then, it's hard-coded into the system. So what I mean by that is that the laws are kind of written in. So this is a diagram from a guy called Lawrence Lessig, who wrote a book called Code is Law. And he says that there's 4 different ways that rules are produced in systems. So you can, say you want somebody to stop speeding past a primary school in your area. You can lobby to get like laws produced that reduce the speed limit to 30 miles an hour. So that would be a law. You can bandy together with your neighbors to try and socially shame somebody into driving slower. So maybe shame them or exclude them. And that would be maybe norms, so that we know it's not right to speed somewhere where children might be crossing the road. You could maybe produce sort of market systems, so where you're penalized or whether you have to pay a lot if you wanted to speed. Or the last one is you could just produce a kind of an architecture. So where the decision's basically out of your hands, it's just hard coded into the system. So put in a speed bump, for example, where somebody has to damage their suspension, basically, if they want to speed. So in some ways, those decisions then are prescribed into the system, and we don't necessarily have any recourse. And secondly, what we're seeing then is that these decisions often involve new relationships between information conglomerates and the state. So this one recently, where Facebook is patenting a technology that's going to help publicly mandated systems like banks discriminate against borrowers based on their social networks. So these are kind of new arrangements then between the people who have access to information and people who govern. So algorithms, I mean, are completely inert unless they're paired with databases on which to function. So it's kind of the combination of those two things which is really significant. So that's, I suppose, where the blockchain comes in and where it's maybe potentially a very, very interesting kind of technology. So Matteo Pasquinelli, for example, talks about the need in the face of algorithmic governance to produce new revolutionary institutions out of data and algorithms. So I suppose it's this kind of idea of fighting fire with fire in some way. So Casey and Ingo have gone through kind of aspects of the blockchain, so I'll probably go through this quite quickly. But I just wanted to think about it as something that I suppose allows for distributed forms of cooperation, but also distributed forms of ownership. So distributed infrastructures or databases, for example. So as a new infrastructure for distributed forms of governance, I suppose it's allowing for new kinds of cooperation at a global scale. So what I mean by that is where maybe a decentralized forms of cooperation are often hampered by the fact that people don't know each other, or they don't exist in the same place, or there isn't maybe a centralized authority then to make decisions for you, that technologies like the blockchain allow sort of a way around that, because they're basically producing a technology that allows for some kind of a consensus between people who don't know or trust each other. And I suppose that's why, you know, Bitcoin was so significant as well. So Primavera de Filippi, who's written quite a lot about this, describes this as governance by design. I mean, if you look at this quote, it's quite, what she's talking about is a form of algorithmic governance. She's saying basically that these rules are embedded directly into the technology of the platforms. But I suppose the difference is that it's a kind of a cooperative or a commons-based or a peer-produced kind of governance, rather than a master-slave governance, for example, as Casey said earlier. So we're seeing, you know, lots of different applications then that are quite interesting in this space. Swarm, for example, is a sort of a distributed crowdfunding application that makes those kind of aspects of that quite transparent. And you have a number of different proposals for voting platforms as well that are based on the blockchain, so that voting could become more transparent. But the second thing, I suppose, that's interesting is that not only that cooperation is distributed, but also that ownership is distributed. So if we think about the ownership of things like servers, infrastructure, energy, spectrum, all of these things as being very, very significant choke points in terms of who has access to data or whether data is open or not, then the idea of being able to actually support some kind of decentralized infrastructure is quite exciting. And that's what some of the people who are looking to actually build applications on the blockchain are proposing. But if the idea of moving away from the state maybe is a little bit extreme, there's lots of possibilities for using blockchains with a partner state, so in partnership with a centralized state, as a way of just encouraging transparency in the way that decisions are being made. So this is an example from Honduras, where they're using blockchains to try and make to follow kind of land registry there and make that process more more explicit or more transparent. Scala Fund then is another application that I just came across about a week or two ago, which again is about crowdfunding for just student fees, but again in kind of a transparent way. This is one of these CoinDesk articles that you never really know how much kind of meat there is. I think it's based on like a kind of passing comment, but the idea was that the government were maybe exploring using blockchain record keeping. It's based on a kind of a small comment by somebody in the digital service, as far as I know. Or you might have heard of blockchain passports as well. So again, this idea that your citizenship could be recorded on the blockchain rather than through some kind of database that's managed specifically by a government. So yeah, I think just to maybe Casey actually kind of talked about this, that what's maybe significant about the blockchain, or what's radical about it, is well, what he talked about in terms of being able to be sure that something's true and being able to be sure that something's current. So in various conversations I've had with people about the blockchain over the last few months, the things that people found so radical was that for the first time maybe that you have a new criterion of reality, by which I mean that you are actually, you're deferring to something else basically to tell you whether something is true, but also that you also have a persistent state for the internet, so truth and also kind of currency. But just to finish up, I wanted to maybe look at some, just critique maybe this idea of the blockchain at the same time. So I'm not sure that you agree with Pasquinelli that we need to create radical institutions through algorithms, or at least not through algorithms and more. I think there has to be something more to it. And that's partly because the history of some of these tools and it's partly because of the politics or the apolitics that they often encode. So while on the one hand, the blockchain is this radical technology that's offering lots of possibilities for the internet and for consensus beyond, human accountability or human error, at the same time, it's part of a history of techniques that aren't really political, that they're not designed to make new political subjects. They're actually designed to make political subjects disappear and kind of recede from the foreground. So in some ways, how am I doing for time? Am I going on for ages and ages? Grand. Okay. Sure. Well, I'm almost finished anyway. But yeah, in some ways the blockchain isn't that radical. Like, we can see it as being part maybe of a whole line of technologies of liberal governance that are designed to replace politics with economics. So Michel Foucault, for example, would argue that since the 18th century, governance has been about creating new kinds of knowledge institutions and new kinds of practices that basically dispel the need for politics, that dispel conflict, that dispel the need for discourse or dispute, and instead about moving towards sort of a statistical reduction of publics as some kind of assembly towards just calculated data points or kind of statistical representations of a public. So I came across this example a while ago, which is actually from the 17th century. So William Petty, who proposes basically political arithmetic. So this was kind of about moving away from the need for reason towards a model of politics which is based on the reduction of individuals to statistical units of measure. Other kind of more, I suppose, current examples, but also still kind of pre-computational, would be something like the whole earth punch card, which you may have or may not have heard of. So it's kind of a precursor to computational databases today that was really, really significant in terms of profiling publics at the turn of the century. So quite instrumental, apparently, in genocide or in World War II in terms of identifying who was Jewish and who wasn't in Germany. So that these technologies have quite, they have a history, I suppose, a biopolitical history in terms of the way that power is being exercised. So I suppose I'd argue that a lot of these technologies reduce political subjects to data points, but also that they're maybe about reducing democracy as also to consensus. So reducing questions of kind of how we govern ourselves to that one issue of whether, whether there's consensus or agreement. So I don't know if you've heard of Kate Crawford. She's a really, really interesting researcher over in the States who's done work around big data. And she's critiquing algorithmic governance on the grounds that a lot of these systems tend to emphasize basically producing some kind of consensus or agreement rather than maybe allowing for debate or dispute to actually come to the fore. Kate Crawford, yeah. And so maybe what about a model of governance that's beyond transparency or consensus, that maybe allows us to design for dispute or dissent or struggle in some kind of way? So this is a quote from Chantal Mouffe, who's a political philosopher. So she's arguing that basically consensus basically just ensures that everything stays the same. So it's about a way of reproducing the status quo. And that maybe what we need is actually ways of thinking about democracy that are different from the traditional liberal concept of democracy to maybe thinking of, which is, about negotiating among interests and among people who are all the same and are kind of alike, to ways that maybe allow you to bring different groups or different interests to the fore. And I guess what we're seeing with algorithms today is that there's quite complicated relationships occurring between people, between institutions, between algorithms, and maybe we need to actually find some slack or some space that allows that to happen. So while the blockchain is really, really exciting, we also have to think outside the technology to other kinds of social institutions. So rather than thinking that we can engineer particular political or social situations, that we also think about the other ways that we actually support alternative models of governance that aren't just about engineering something into a system. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Do you have your own ideal design?
Ideal design, like technical design, you mean?
Either technical stuff.
Well, actually, I did an interview. I didn't talk about this, but I did an interview with this woman, Alison Powell, recently for peer-to-peer. So Dennis mentioned I do some work with the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and part of that is we have this thing called 100 Women in Peer-to-Peer, where we interview different women who are working in different aspects of commons-based peer production. And this was an interview with a woman called Alison Powell, who works in the London School of Economics. And she does really interesting work around open data, actually, and open citizenship, but also community wireless networks. So I met her when I was over in Montreal at a conference and did an interview with her. And she had some really, I think, interesting things to say in terms of critiquing this idea of governance for design, which I agreed with. And I suppose her idea is that basically, you know, we need to find ways of, I mean, it's kind of maybe an obvious thing. We need to find ways of producing kind of discourses or dialogues between people who are really interested in kind of the technical side of things, and then people who actually have a lot of experience in social forms of, you know, social movements and social activism. And I guess finding a way of allowing them to talk to each other, and maybe just being a little bit less deterministic about the technologies that we're using. The technologies don't instantiate social or political relationships. Yeah. So.
I have a question. So I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to ask that from that perspective. You've used this term algorithmic governance. How do you define this exactly?
I wish I had my laptop, because I got rid of a slide which is from an article by Tim O'Reilly. I don't know if you know, he's the founder of O'Reilly Media, and he published an article. I'll see if I can remember. So he has 4 different points about algorithmic governance and kind of what it does. And so he was arguing in favor of algorithmic governance in an article that he published about 2 years ago. So algorithmic governance is forms of governance that uses software basically to govern and make decisions. And so that was the first criteria. I suppose it was using software. Then there was the rules were hard coded into the system, and he thought this was all very positive. And then also that there's sort of a recursion, that basically the rules are they're kind of heuristic or intelligent, and that they can test whether something's working and make changes to optimize the system and make it work better. Evgeny Morozov, I don't know if you've come across him. So he's I think a Ukrainian writer who's written a couple of really good articles about algorithmic governance as well in The Guardian, and different examples of that. So does that explain it?
Basically taking people out of making political decisions or determining actions.
Yeah.
And letting computers decide, letting the numbers decide based on a series of probabilities.
Yeah. Basically, that's basically the idea. Yeah, and they think that would be more sophisticated, because you're removing human error and basically treating these problems like something that can be, you know, solved in that way, I guess. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about having those prejudices and these hard coding stuff, because obviously, like, the machine making a decision, someone had to write the software. What about having like open source algorithms to make those decisions, so that anyone can contribute to them? Would that be a way to kind of increase the level of transparency in these decision making, or would you just get that same problem where you've got the general consensus and nothing really changes?
I don't know. I mean, I guess being able to see the processes that are involved in writing a particular code and how that's put together makes it more transparent. But I guess a lot of the problems with these prejudices is that they're not that obvious. If you say that to computer scientists, they'll normally say, but there is no prejudice, or we can actually work to code out that prejudice. But they're, you know, they come together in ways that aren't like obvious, and often that's about the interaction, you know, between even databases and algorithms and how they work together. So there was one example recently, this is in June, don't know where it is, sorry, that I skipped over, where you know, Google has a thing for automatically labeling images as well. So again, this was a mistake that was made, and where 2 black people were basically labeled as gorillas based on the based on the kinds of the algorithms that are being used. So that's kind of a racist the thing that's being built in the same way that, you know, the he invented, she invented thing is. But basically all that's doing is it's also building on existing prejudices and kind of encoding those in the system. So the fact that there's a lot more historical evidence of men inventing things than women. So yeah.
Yeah. Go on.
Sorry, change.org in relation to the blockchain.
Just in relation to blockchain, this is what it's about, change.org, institutions like that.
And how they would work? Are they working with the?
Do they need blockchain for authenticity?
I don't think so, really. But I suppose I haven't really thought about it. What do you think?
Well, I was just wondering what you thought of change.org, because you have a whole team about blockchain and how to make changes and stuff. There's websites out there trying to do that.
I have opinions. I guess that's a whole other maybe discussion around activism and social media. But
like right now, the documents, all the numbers which are collected on citizen behalf and taxpayers expense, they are released in PDF format. And the reason why the government organization give in PDF, because they want to preserve to authenticity, as was case was discussed. There is no need for it. Yes, the digital signature can be applied on this document, and the document will be still machine readable. So I don't think that, like, I believe that this system can complement the existing system. It's not going to replace it anytime soon. Oh, yes, sorry. That's, yeah, go on with the question.
And what you're thinking about is what you have on the screen right now.
sorry.
There's like the Google thing here, and also the previous slide which you just showed with mistake image recognition.
This one.
Previously held Google very somewhat personally accountable for these mistakes, as if it was them that did it. It's actually their algorithm. This is what their computers have do. Their algorithms, what it's figured out. You see, I think this sort of applies to the theory of algorithmic government. You can see, well, for example, racial profiling on Amazon and other things, right? That's not due to something that some developers put in. That's through statistics. The computer has analyzed that they're more likely to get sales and stuff if they put that sort of thing there. So, same sort of thing can possibly corrupt the same theories of algorithmic governance. I think it's important to note that the algorithms which are going to be used for this are put in. They're made to accomplish their goal, right? The goal of, say, the Amazon one, that was to get people to click on these adverts. Their goal is to get clicks, and yeah, sure, it will do that through. It doesn't take anything else into account. It doesn't take any social constructs or anything into that.
So maybe if you design different algorithms, you mean that are more socially aware, that you can overcome that. Sorry, you want to finish it? Yeah, sorry, I think there's
I just wanted to ask you to pick up the point that was just made there about this notion of algorithmic governance, because I'm not sure that it doesn't really make sense to use those kind of terms and to say that it is the algorithm that's doing the governance, right? Because ultimately there comes a hard point where we move out of technological and into the real world, right? And into interactions between people that actually matter in a physical sense, right? Mm-hmm. So in that case, is it sensible to talk about the algorithm doing the governance when, you know, okay, machine says X, but people decide to ignore machine and say Y?
Maybe, but I guess I can see what you mean. That on one hand, it's deterministic, maybe to speak about an algorithm as though it doesn't have all these kinds of institutions behind it. But I think that the problem is that we can't always just ignore that. So say if you go to the airport and for some reason you're stopped at security, the person at security doesn't even necessarily know why you've been stopped. It's some kind of an algorithm. So that decision isn't transparent. So it's difficult to... It can be difficult to unpick that as well, or find the kind of social...
So it turns out you're going to be able to see a whole bunch of articles about this tomorrow on the internet. Because if you do a search tonight for a dancing baby, the Ninth Circuit Court in the United States just ruled it was a
CA case where the algorithm picked the video out of YouTube and banned it 7 years ago. Hasn't been back on YouTube since. EFF jumped in on the side of the video. Universal Studios jumped in on the other side, and they've been battling it back and forth. So here's a very practical, leading edge. An algorithm made a decision, automatically flagged the content creator with a legal document, a takedown notice, removed their content from the service provider, and it has been battling in the courts ever since. That may seem fairly trivial for a YouTube video, but when that becomes your LinkedIn profile or some site that you've got set up and you happen to have some infringing content that's automatically being scanned by a megacorp for its own content to have to battle, obviously, very few people have the resources to battle this for 7 years to get this content reposted. I mean, is the world a better place if there's a more dancing baby video on YouTube? You should be able to find plenty of articles on both sides of this issue. The biggest commentary being that the court had an opportunity to declare an opinion on algorithmic governance, and they chose not to make any comment on it. And so that's a very issue. So we are unfortunately out of time. I'd like to get everybody another round of applause for all of our speakers.